Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And want to give a big shout out to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello. Fine fellow, that one. His suggestion for today's deep dive got me thinking back to this one time I was running a tabletop campaign. And one of my players, bless his heart, decided to play an elf paladin who was pushing 800 years old. Now this paladin, we'll call him Eldrin, had a reputation for being cautious. The party was in this crumbling temple, classic dungeon crawl, right? And they found this ancient inscription warning of a terrible curse that would befall anyone who disturbed the tomb at the end of the hallway, the rest of the party. A bunch of hot-headed humans and a dwarf with a penchant for smashing things. They wanted to barge right in. But Eldrin pulls out this worn, leather-bound journal and starts scribbling down notes. The other players are looking at him like, dude, what are you doing? And he just calmly says, I'm documenting this. We don't know enough yet. He spent the rest of the session researching local legends, consulting ancient texts, and even using divination magic to get a sense of the tomb's history. It took them several sessions because they took their time. They were actually able to lift the curse before they even stepped foot in the tomb. The other players were floored. It was a masterclass in how a different perspective on time can completely change how you approach a problem. And that's what we're diving into today. Kathy Stone's Through Ancient Eyes article over on LitRPG Reads. It's packed with insights on how to roleplay elven longevity and wisdom in a way that goes beyond just, the pointy ears and the whole lives for 1,000 years thing. We're going to unpack what makes elves tick, why they act the way they do, and how you can bring those nuances to life in your own games.
That campaign story, it really does illustrate a point the article makes early on about elven perception of time. Imagine for a moment that the entire lifespan of a human feels to you like, say, a month does to us. Would you be rushing to make decisions with such limited information? Probably not. This is where the idea of time as a river comes in. Elves see time as this vast, flowing current. They understand that everything is in flux, and that change is the only constant. This allows them to approach challenges with a level of patience and serenity that can be baffling, even frustrating, to shorter-lived races. They know that eventually even the most turbulent waters will calm.
Yeah, it's almost like they have this built-in chill factor, right? Like they've seen empires rise and fall, trends come and go. They understand that most things in the grand scheme of things are temporary.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And this long view doesn't just affect how they react to current events. It profoundly shapes their memories and their sense of self. The article uses this really powerful analogy. It says that memories for an elf are like the rings of an ancient tree. Each ring represents a period of growth, a layer of experience. Imagine having centuries worth of those rings. It would make for one heavy tree, wouldn't it? Now imagine trying to make a decision with the weight of all those memories informing your judgment. It's no wonder elves are often portrayed as cautious and deliberate. They're not just considering the immediate consequences of their actions, they're thinking about how those actions will ripple through time, potentially affecting generations to come.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. If you're an elf carrying around centuries of memories, wouldn't that make it difficult to let go of the past? Like, what if you're holding on to a grudge from, 500 years ago?
It's certainly a possibility. And it speaks to a concept the article calls memory weight. Just as an ancient tree is shaped by every year of growth, every hardship, every storm it's weathered, so too is an elf shaped by their vast experiences. This can manifest in a few different ways. There's Sankofa, which is this idea of constantly reflecting on the past to inform present actions. Elves are always learning from their experiences, drawing on their memories to guide their choices. It's part of what makes them wise and insightful, but it can also lead to a sense of nostalgic veneration. Elves might be more likely to cling to traditions, artifacts, and ways of life that have endured for centuries. It's a way of honoring their past, but it can also make them resistant to change. They've seen countless trends come and go, so they might be hesitant to embrace something new, especially if it threatens the things they hold dear.
That makes sense. And it also makes them really interesting to play.
Yeah.
Because it creates this tension, right, between their wisdom and their potential for stubbornness.
Absolutely. It's a balancing act. And it's what makes elves so much more than just pointy-eared stereotypes. They're complex beings with their own internal struggles. They're trying to navigate the present while carrying the weight of centuries on their shoulders.
It's like they're walking a tightrope between the past and the future.
That's a great analogy. And this tension isn't just limited to their actions. It also colors their emotional lives. The article points out that elven emotions run deep. They're not as quick to anger or joy as shorter-lived races. They experience feelings over much longer periods, like a slow, steady burn rather than a sudden explosion.
So it's not that they don't feel things. It's that their emotions have this different texture to them. Like joy for an elf isn't a fleeting burst, it's a sustained glow. And sorrow isn't a passing storm, it's a lingering mist.
Exactly. And because of that, they might express themselves differently. They might favor subtlety over grand displays of emotion. Think about it. If you have centuries to process your feelings, you're probably not going to be as quick to react in the heat of the moment.
Right. It's like their emotions are these deep underground rivers. They're powerful, but they're not always visible on the surface.
Perfect analogy. And this might make them seem reserved or even aloof to others. But it's not that they don't feel things deeply, it's that they experience those feelings over much longer periods.
Which, when you think about it, can make for some really interesting role-playing opportunities.
Yeah.
Because you can have these moments where an elf character seems completely calm and collected on the surface, but underneath there's this whole storm of emotions brewing.
It's a great way to add depth and complexity to your character. Instead of just reacting to every situation, immediately you can play the long game with their emotions. Let them simmer and build over time. It can make for some truly powerful moments when those emotions finally do surface. It's like a volcano that's been dormant for centuries, suddenly erupting with a force that nobody could have predicted.
That's a great image. And it makes me think about how elves would approach relationships with shorter-lived races. Because if you're an elf knowing that your human friend is going to age and die while you're still relatively young, that's got to have a profound impact on how you view that relationship.
The article delves into this, and it's a topic rife with both beautiful and melancholic potential. Imagine falling deeply in love, knowing that from your perspective, the relationship is likely to be temporary. It's a lot to process, and I think it would make any elf cautious about forming strong attachments.
Yeah, you'd probably want to savor every moment knowing how precious and fleeting they are.
Exactly. Friendships with shorter-lived beings might feel like beautiful sunsets, breathtaking and vibrant, but ultimately fading away. And romantic relationships, well, those could be incredibly poignant, tinged with the bittersweet awareness of the passage of time.
It's almost like they're constantly aware of the double-edged sword of their long lifespan. They get to experience so much, but they also have to say goodbye to so many people they care about along the way.
It's a fascinating paradox. And it adds a whole other layer to the concept of elven wisdom, because they're not just wise in the sense of having a lot of knowledge, they're also wise in the sense of understanding the ephemeral nature of life and the importance of cherishing the moments they have.
It's a beautiful, albeit somewhat melancholy perspective.
It is, and I think it's something that we can all learn from, even if we don't have centuries to ponder the mysteries of existence.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, talking about how elves perceive time, the weight of their memories and their deep, slow-burning emotions. But I think what's really fascinating is how all of this ties into their strategic thinking. Because if you have a different relationship with time, it's bound to affect how you approach problem-solving and decision-making.
Absolutely does, and that's what we'll be exploring in this next part of our deep dive into elven strategic thinking. We'll unpack how elves think strategically, how they plan for the long game, and how they approach challenges with a level of foresight that can seem almost supernatural to shorter-lived races.
All right, so let's break down this elven strategic mindset. The article talks about how elves think in terms of centuries, not seconds. But what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how does that translate into their actions and decisions?
Think of it this way. Imagine you're playing a game of chess, but your opponent is playing a game of Go. Chess is all about immediate tactics, capturing pieces, and controlling the board in the short term. But Go is about long-term strategy-building influence and patiently maneuvering your pieces to create an inescapable web of pressure. That's kind of how elves approach problems. They're not just reacting to the immediate situation. They're thinking about the second-order effects, the ripple effects that their actions will have years, even decades down the line. They're looking for those subtle pressure points, those seemingly insignificant moves that will eventually lead to a decisive advantage.
Okay, so they're playing the long game, but how do they actually do that? Like, where do they even begin? I feel like my brain would short-circuit trying to think that far ahead.
The article touches on this idea of historical pattern recognition. Because they've lived for so long, elves have witnessed countless cycles of history. They've seen empires rise and fall, conflicts erupt and subside, trends come and go. They've amassed this vast library of historical knowledge that informs their decision-making. They can see the echoes of the past in the present. They understand that certain actions tend to lead to certain outcomes. And they use that knowledge to anticipate potential problems, to identify opportunities, and to craft strategies that are tailored to the specific situation.
So it's not just about being patient. It's about having this deep understanding of cause and effect, of how actions ripple through time. They're like master historians who can apply the lessons of the past to the challenges of the present.
Precisely. And it's not just about historical knowledge. The article also emphasizes the importance of what it calls generational planning. Because elves live for so long, they're not just thinking about their own individual goals, they're thinking about the legacy they'll leave behind for their descendants.
So it's like they're playing a multi-generational game of chess. They're making moves that won't pay off for decades, maybe even centuries.
Exactly. The article gives the example of an elf who's tasked with protecting a forest. They're not just thinking about how to protect the trees from immediate threats like logging or fire. They're thinking about how to ensure the forest's health and vitality for generations to come. They might plant slow-growing, long-lived trees, knowing that their descendants will benefit from their foresight. They might establish alliances with other creatures who can help to maintain the ecosystem's balance. They're playing a much longer game than most of us could even comprehend.
Okay, that's starting to make more sense. But I have to admit, I'm still struggling to wrap my head around the practical implications of all this. Like if I'm playing an elf in a game, how do I actually show this kind of strategic thinking? It feels like it could easily become this abstract, intangible thing that's hard to portray in a way that's engaging for other players.
It's a valid concern. And I think the key is to focus on specific, actionable choices that reflect your character's long-term thinking. Let's go back to that example of the elf protecting the forest. How would they approach that task differently from, say, a human or a dwarf?
Well, I imagine a human might focus on building walls, establishing patrols, maybe training a militia to defend the forest. A dwarf might dig elaborate tunnels and fortifications, creating a subterranean fortress to protect the forest's heart. But what would an elf do?
An elf might spend years cultivating relationships with the forest spirits, learning their language, understanding their needs. They might plant trees that have magical properties, creating a natural barrier against intruders. They might weave enchantments into the very fabric of the forest, subtly manipulating its energies to deter those who would do it harm.
So they're working with the forest.
Yeah.
Not just for it. They're playing a more subtle, nuanced game.
Exactly, and that subtlety can be really powerful in a role-playing game. It's not always about grand gestures or epic battles. It's about making those small, deliberate choices that reflect your character's long-term thinking.
Okay, so let's say my elf character is part of a group that's trying to overthrow a tyrannical ruler. How would they approach that challenge differently from a shorter-lived race?
A human might immediately start rallying troops, plotting a rebellion, maybe even launching a daring raid on the tyrant's stronghold. But an elf might spend years, even decades, subtly undermining the tyrant's power. They might sow seeds of discontent among the populace, forge alliances with disaffected nobles, and gather intelligence on the tyrant's weaknesses. They might even manipulate events to create opportunities for their allies to strike without directly involving themselves.
So they're playing the puppet master, they're pulling the strings from behind the scenes, orchestrating events to their advantage.
That's a great way to visualize it. And it's a role that elves can excel at. They're patient, they're cunning, and they have a deep understanding of how power dynamics work.
It's almost like they're playing a game of 4D chess, where time is the fourth dimension.
I love that analogy. And it highlights how Elven strategic thinking can be both fascinating and challenging to portray in a game. It requires a different mindset, a willingness to think outside the box and to embrace those unconventional solutions.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also incredibly rewarding when you can pull it off. It's like you're tapping into a different level of strategic thinking, one that's informed by centuries of experience and wisdom.
And that's where the real fun of role-playing an elf comes in. It's about embracing those unique perspectives and seeing the world through ancient eyes. It's about challenging yourself to think differently, to plan for the long game, and to make those subtle, calculated moves that can change the course of history.
It's like you're stepping into the role of a grand strategist, a master manipulator, a patient weaver of fate. And that's pretty darn cool.
It is. And when you combine the strategic thinking with their deep understanding of magic, well, that's when things get truly epic.
Oh, right. We haven't even talked about magic yet. The article mentions this concept of deep magic, and I'm really curious to hear more about that.
It's a fascinating concept, and it speaks to the idea that for elves, magic isn't just a tool or a weapon. It's an extension of their being an integral part of their worldview.
All right, let's dive into that. How is elven magic different from, say, human magic?
Well, if human magic is like a rushing river, powerful and unpredictable, elven magic is like a deep, still lake. It's subtle, it's elegant, and it runs incredibly deep.
So it's not about flashy spells and explosions.
Not necessarily. Elves have a deep reverence for the natural world, and their magic reflects that. They see magic as an extension of nature, as a force that flows through everything.
So it's less about controlling magic and more about working with it,
Yeah.
harmonizing with it.
Exactly. And because they have such long lifespans, they've had centuries to study magic, to refine their techniques, to delve into its mysteries.
It's like they've become masters of a language that most other races barely understand.
That's a great analogy. They speak the language of magic fluently, effortlessly weaving spells and enchantments that are both beautiful and powerful.
Okay, so give me an example. How would an elf use magic to protect that forest we were talking about earlier?
Well, instead of erecting a wall of fire or summoning a legion of elementals, they might weave enchantments into the very trees themselves. These enchantments might subtly alter the forest's energy, creating a sense of unease or disorientation in anyone who enters with malicious intent. They might use illusions to conceal paths, making it impossible for intruders to find their way. Or they might whisper to the wind, carrying messages to allies who can come to the forest's aid.
It's all so subtle. It's like they're playing a game of whispers and shadows.
Exactly. And that's what makes elven magic so fascinating. It's not always about brute force or spectacle. It's about working with the subtle energies of the world, manipulating them with precision and finesse.
It's like they're conductors of an orchestra, directing the flow of magic with an expert touch.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And when you combine that mastery of magic with their strategic thinking and their long-term perspective, well, that's when you start to see the true depth of elven power.
All right, so we've talked about elven strategy, their deep connection to magic, and how their long lifespans shape their worldview. But I'm curious, what about their views on mortality? I mean, if you're going to live for centuries, wouldn't you start to see death differently?
That's a question the article explores, and it's a really thought-provoking one. For elves, death isn't seen as an ending, but as a transition shouldering, a natural part of the cycle of life. They've witnessed countless generations come and go, and they understand that death is simply a return to the source, emerging back into the flow of time.
So it's less about fear and more about acceptance.
Precisely. They don't dwell on death or fear it. Instead, they celebrate the lives of those who have passed, honoring their memories and carrying their wisdom forward.
It's a beautiful way to look at it, really. It takes away the sting of loss and replaces it with a sense of continuity.
It does. And it also speaks to their profound connection to nature. They see life and death as part of the natural order, as the ebb and flow of a tide that's been running for millennia.
It's like they're living in harmony with the rhythms of the universe.
Exactly. And that harmony extends to their relationships with other races, especially those with much shorter lifespans.
Right, we were talking about that earlier, how it must be bittersweet for an elf to form bonds with people who they know are going to age and die much sooner than they will.
The article addresses this, acknowledging that it's a complex and often melancholic aspect of their existence. But it also emphasizes that elves cherish these relationships, knowing that they add depth and meaning to their long lives. They understand that even though these connections are temporary, they're still incredibly valuable.
It's like they're constantly reminded of the preciousness of life, which makes them appreciate every moment even more.
And I think that's a really powerful lesson even for those of us who don't have centuries to ponder the mysteries of existence. It's a reminder to slow down, to savor the moments we have, and to cherish the connections we make no matter how long they last.
That's a beautiful sentiment. And it brings us to another fascinating aspect of elven culture, their approach to teaching and mentorship. Because if you've lived for centuries, you've got a lot of wisdom to share, right? But how do you pass that knowledge on in a way that's meaningful and impactful?
That's a great question, and it's one that the article delves into. For elves, mentorship is a deeply ingrained part of their culture. Older elves are revered as guides and teachers, passing down their knowledge and experience to younger generations.
But it's not just about rote learning, is it?
No, it's much more about fostering critical thinking and encouraging younger elves to find their own paths. The article mentions that they often use Socratic dialogue, asking questions to stimulate reflection and debate. They want their students to think for themselves, to challenge assumptions, and to arrive at their own conclusions.
It's like they're creating these spaces where knowledge can be shared and explored collaboratively.
Exactly, and they also use storytelling as a powerful teaching tool. Imagine the kinds of stories an elf could tell having lived for centuries and witnessed so much history. Their tales would be filled with wisdom, intrigue, and perhaps even a touch of melancholy.
Oh, man. I'd love to sit around a campfire and listen to an elf recount tales of ancient battles, lost civilizations, and mythical creatures. I bet their stories would be epic.
They certainly would. And as players, we can incorporate that love of storytelling into our role-playing. Maybe our elf character has a knack for weaving tales into their conversations, using metaphors and allegories to illustrate their points. Or perhaps they're a master of riddles and puzzles, challenging others to think outside the box.
It's a great way to add depth and dimension to your character to make them feel truly ancient and wise.
It is. And it can also be a lot of fun for the other players at the table. Who doesn't love a good story? Especially when it's told by a character who's seen and done it all.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, talking about Elven's strategic thinking, their deep connection to magic, their views on mortality, their approach to teaching and mentorship, and even their love of storytelling. It's clear that these are complex, nuanced beings with a lot to offer the world of role-playing. But I'm curious, what are some of the challenges that players might face when trying to portray these nuances authentically?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I think we should all keep in mind as we create and play our elven characters. It's easy to fall into the trap of playing stereotypes. But the real challenge and the real reward lies in embracing the depth and complexity of these ancient beings. Remember, they're not just wise sages or stoic warriors. They're individuals with their own unique stories, experiences, and perspectives.
So to all you aspiring elf role players out there, I encourage you to dig deep, explore those nuances, and bring your elven characters to life in a way that's both authentic and unforgettable. And a big thank you once again to Paul Bello, fine fellow, for suggesting this incredible deep dive. Until next time, happy gaming, everyone.